Fort Worth, Texas, 1993. A quiet apartment becomes the stage for a tragedy that would haunt the community for years. Steven Robards, a fit 38-year-old father, collapses and dies unexpectedly. The diagnosis is simple: a sudden, tragic heart attack. For a year, 16-year-old Marie Robards plays the part of the grieving, perfect daughter, until the ghost of her father begins to whisper. This is a story of a chemical betrayal inspired by a stolen formula and the haunting lines of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the winter of 1993, one must first look at the man who stood at the center of a world he believed was stable, secure, and filled with a quiet kind of love. Steven Robards was, by all accounts, the quintessential suburban father, a man whose life was defined by the steady, rhythmic pulse of hard work and parental devotion. At 38 years old, he had built a life for himself in Fort Worth, Texas, that many would envy, not for its glamour, but for its reliability. He worked as a tax assessor, a job that required a meticulous eye and a calm temperament, qualities that bled into his role as a father. Steven was a man of routines. He was the type of person who ensured the lawn was perfectly manicured, the bills were paid on time, and his daughter Marie had every opportunity to succeed. Marie Robards was the light of Steven's life, his only child, a bright, beautiful, and exceptionally gifted girl who seemed to be the perfect reflection of his efforts. Growing up in the suburban sprawl of North Texas, Marie was more than just a good student. She was a star. At Eastern Hills High School, she was known for her sharp intellect, her participation in the choir, and her place in the honors program. To the outside world, the bond between Steven and Marie was unbreakable. Following a difficult divorce from Marie's mother, Beth, several years earlier, Steven had fought for and won primary custody of his daughter. It was a role he took with immense seriousness, perhaps even a touch of overcompensation, as he tried to fill the emotional void left by a fractured home. But beneath the surface of this perfect suburban life, a different narrative was being written in the mind of a 16-year-old girl. While Steven saw their life in Fort Worth as a sanctuary, Marie increasingly viewed it as a cage. The divorce had not just split the family, it had created two competing worlds. In Texas, there was the world of Steven: academic expectations, rules, structured evenings, and the mundane reality of a father who, despite his love, could be seen as stifling. In Florida, there was the world of her mother, Beth. To Marie, Florida represented a kind of vibrant, sun-drenched freedom that her life in Fort Worth lacked. Beth was the more spontaneous parent, the one who offered emotional intensity and a connection that Marie craved with a desperation that bordered on obsession. The distance between Texas and Florida was more than just miles. It was a psychological chasm that Marie couldn't seem to bridge. Throughout her early teens, Marie struggled with a profound sense of displacement. She was a mama's girl, trapped in a daddy's world. Steven, ever the pragmatist, believed that stability was the greatest gift he could provide. He provided a safe home, a focused environment for her studies, and a future that looked bright and certain. He didn't realize that for Marie, his very presence was the obstacle standing between her and the life she imagined with her mother. She didn't want the tax assessor's stability. She wanted the chaotic, affectionate proximity of a woman who was half a continent away. As Marie entered her sophomore year, the internal friction began to manifest in quiet, invisible ways. She remained an honors student, her grades never wavering, but her interests began to veer toward the dark and the complex. She was a brilliant student of science, particularly chemistry, a subject that offered her a sense of control over the physical world. In the lab, she found a language for her frustrations, a way to manipulate elements to achieve a desired result. Her teachers saw a dedicated scholar. Her father saw a daughter destined for greatness. Neither could see that Marie was beginning to look at the world through a lens of cold, calculated logic. The social atmosphere of Fort Worth in the early 90s provided a backdrop of normalcy that made Marie's inner turmoil even harder to detect. It was an era of big hair, suburban malls, and the pressure to conform to the image of the successful American family. Marie played her part to perfection. She was the girl other parents pointed to as an example, articulate, talented, and seemingly well-adjusted. But the resentment toward her father was growing like a slow-acting poison in her own mind. She felt that as long as Steven was alive, as long as he held the legal right to her presence, she would never be truly free to go to her mother. Steven, meanwhile, continued to pour his energy into his daughter's future. He was immensely proud of her academic achievements, often boasting to colleagues about her intelligence and her potential. He viewed her interest in the sciences as a stepping stone to a prestigious career, never imagining that the tools of her education would become the instruments of his own end. Their relationship was characterized by a quiet harmony that hid a growing, jagged edge. He would cook for her, drive her to rehearsals, and support her ambitions, all while she sat across from him at the dinner table, smiling through a mask of growing contempt. This period of their lives was a masterclass in deception, not the kind of deception that involves loud arguments or rebellious outbursts, but the quiet, suffocating kind that exists within the heart of a perfect child. Marie wasn't a rebel in the traditional sense. She didn't sneak out or fail her classes. Instead, she retreated into a private world of fantasy and academic focus, where the lines between her schoolwork and her personal desires began to blur. She began to see her life as a drama, one where the characters were fixed in their roles, and only a radical change could rewrite the script. The biography of Marie Robards up to this point is not one of obvious trauma or abuse. It is a biography of a girl who had everything, but wanted the one thing she felt her father was denying her: a life without him. The halls of Eastern Hills High School were a labyrinth of adolescent noise, the clatter of lockers, and the heavy, lingering scent of floor wax and cafeteria steam. For Marie Robards, these corridors were not just a place of learning. They were the testing grounds for a mask she wore with terrifying precision. She was a girl who lived in the margins of her own brilliance, an honors student who excelled in the sciences while her heart drifted nearly 1,200 miles away to the humid, sun-drenched coast of Florida. To her peers and teachers, she was the model of suburban success, a quiet, focused student who seemed destined for the University of Texas. But inside, a dangerous fantasy was beginning to take root, fueled by a singular, obsessive desire to be reunited with her mother, Beth. The obsession with Florida was not merely a childhood whim. It was a psychological anchor that pulled Marie away from the life her father, Steven, had built for her in Fort Worth. She viewed her father's apartment not as a home, but as a temporary station in a life she never asked for. Every rule Steven enforced, every dinner they shared, and every academic goal he encouraged felt like another brick in a wall separating her from the freedom she believed awaited her in her mother's arms. This emotional displacement created a void that Marie began to fill with the cold, logical certainties of her chemistry class. The chemistry lab was a sanctuary of glass and steel, a place where the world could be broken down into its base elements and manipulated with the turn of a burner or the measured pour of a beaker. It was here, among the periodic tables and the smell of sulfur and ozone, that Marie's academic curiosity took a dark, utilitarian turn. She wasn't just studying for an A anymore. She was looking for a solution, a literal chemical solution to the problem of her father. During her lectures, she learned about the various compounds stored in the school's locked supply cabinets, noting which ones were colorless, which were odorless, and which could slip unnoticed into a home-cooked meal. The formula she eventually settled on was barium acetate. In the school's inventory, it was a white, crystalline solid, appearing as innocuous as sugar or salt to the untrained eye. To Marie, however, it was the key to her cage. She researched the compound with the meticulousness of a professional, discovering that it was highly soluble and, more importantly, that it could mimic the symptoms of a natural cardiac event. It was a poison that promised to leave no obvious trace, a silent assassin that would do her work for her and allow her to slip away to Florida without the messy fallout of a traditional crime. As her scientific plan materialized, her extracurricular life provided the thematic inspiration she needed to justify the act. Marie was heavily involved in the school's drama department, and that semester, the class was deep into the study of Shakespeare's Hamlet. The play is a masterpiece of poison, betrayal, and the restless ghosts of fathers, and for Marie, the parallels were inescapable. She spent her afternoons rehearsing lines about the foul and most unnatural murder, all while harboring her own unnatural secret. The literary world of Elsinore, with its schemes and its juice of cursed Hebanon poured into an ear, became the mirror in which she viewed her own life. She wasn't just a teenager in Texas, she was a tragic figure in a grand drama where the removal of a king was the only way for the princess to claim her destiny. The formula and the fantasy merged in the quiet moments of her school day. She would sit in the back of the classroom, her notebook open not to history notes, but to the logistical details of her plan. She considered the timing, the dosage, and the delivery method. She knew that Steven's favorite meal was tacos, a dish where the heavy seasoning and varied textures could easily hide the slight grittiness of a dissolved chemical. The fantasy of Florida, of the sand under her feet and the absence of her father's expectations, was so vivid it felt more real than the desk she sat at or the voice of the teacher at the chalkboard. The act of theft was a moment of cold, adrenaline-fueled precision. During a period when the lab was unsupervised or the teacher's back was turned, Marie slipped into the storage area where the more hazardous chemicals were kept. Her hands didn't shake as she reached for the container of barium acetate. She didn't hesitate as she transferred a lethal amount into a small plastic baggie and tucked it deep into her school bag, hidden among her honors textbooks and her script for Hamlet. In that moment, the transition from student to predator was complete. She carried the weight of the poison through the hallways, past her friends, and out the front doors of the school, feeling a strange sense of empowerment. The psychological justification she built was an intricate structure of denial. She told herself, and would later tell investigators, that she didn't necessarily want to kill her father. She simply wanted to make him so ill that he could no longer care for her, forcing the state to send her back to her mother in Florida. It was the logic of a child who understood the how of chemistry but refused to acknowledge the what of mortality. She viewed the barium acetate not as an instrument of death, but as a travel permit. As she walked home that day, the chemical was a secret fire in her pocket, a promise that the life she hated was about to end, and the fantasy she craved was finally within her reach. She was ready to pour her own version of the Hebanon, and the stage was set for a dinner that would change everything. The evening of February 18, 1993, began with the kind of mundane, suburban stillness that defines the life of the Texas middle class. In Fort Worth, the air carried a lingering winter chill, a damp, biting cold that settled into the pavement and made the windows of the Robards' apartment sweat with condensation. Inside, the kitchen was bathed in the warm, artificial glow of overhead fluorescent lights, casting long, sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. Marie Robards, a 16-year-old with a mind as sharp as a scalpel, stood at the counter, moving with a calm, rhythmic precision that would have looked like typical teenage domesticity to any casual observer. She was preparing dinner, a simple meal of tacos, a favorite of her father's. But on this night, the seasoning would include something far more potent than cumin or chili powder. Earlier that afternoon, Marie had walked the halls of Eastern Hills High School with a secret tucked deep inside her backpack, nestled between her honors chemistry notes and her well-worn copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet. She had spent weeks studying the properties of barium acetate, a chemical she had carefully extracted from the school's supply room, a white, crystalline powder that looked almost identical to the salt she now sprinkled over the sizzling ground beef. In her mind, the lines of the play she was studying for drama class looped like a haunting soundtrack, the juice of cursed Hebanon being poured into a king's ear, a foul and most unnatural murder. But Marie didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as a director, someone finally taking control of a script she had hated for too long. The sizzle of the meat filled the small kitchen, a sound so ordinary it felt like a shield against the gravity of what was happening. Marie stirred the skillet, the steam rising to dampen her face, her eyes fixed on the darkening hue of the beef. When the time came, she reached for the small plastic baggie. Her hands were steady. There was no cinematic tremble, no second guessing. She measured out the barium acetate, a lethal dose, calculated with the cold efficiency of an honors student, and stirred it into the mixture. The compound was odorless and colorless once dissolved, a a phantom element that vanished into the heavy, spicy aroma of the taco seasoning. She plated the food, setting the table with a meticulousness that felt like a ritual, waiting for the sound of her father's key in the lock. Steven Robards arrived home around 6 p.m., exhausted from a long day as a tax assessor, but visibly pleased to find his daughter had prepared a hot meal. He was a man who lived for these small moments of connection, a father who viewed his quiet life with Marie as his greatest achievement after the wreckage of his divorce. He told her about the mundane stresses of his day, the paperwork and the city politics, while Marie listened, or appeared to. She watched him take the first bite, then the second. She watched the man who had raised her, who had fought for her, unknowingly consume the very thing that would stop his heart. There was a surreal quality to the dinner, a teenage girl and her father, sharing a meal in a quiet apartment, while a silent chemical timer began to tick toward zero. The first signs of the poison's work appeared almost immediately after the meal was finished. Steven began to complain of a strange, tightening sensation in his chest and a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea. He initially dismissed it as a simple case of food poisoning or perhaps a touch of the flu that had been circulating through the office. But the progression was too rapid, too violent to be anything ordinary. Within the hour, he was doubled over in the bathroom, his body racked by severe vomiting and abdominal pain. Marie stood in the hallway, the cool air of the apartment pressing against her skin, watching the father she supposedly loved descend into a physical agony she had personally orchestrated. As the barium acetate began to wreak havoc on Steven's system, blocking the potassium channels in his cells and leading to a rapid, life-threatening drop in his blood potassium levels, his muscles began to fail. He told Marie that his legs felt heavy, like lead, and that a strange tingling was spreading through his fingertips and toes. He was losing his ability to stand, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that echoed off the tiled walls of the bathroom. It was a terrifying, paralyzed descent, a body shutting down while the mind remained fully aware of the encroaching darkness. Marie didn't rush to the phone. She didn't scream for the neighbors. Instead, she played the part of the concerned but helpless daughter, asking him what she should do, her voice a practiced mask of adolescent panic. By the time Marie finally dialed 911, the situation had reached a critical mass. The dispatcher heard a girl's voice, high-pitched and frantic, reporting that her father had collapsed and was struggling to breathe. It was a performance that would hold up for over a year, a masterpiece of deception. When the paramedics arrived at the apartment, the scene was one of domestic chaos. They found Steven lying on the floor, his skin a sickly, ashen gray, his heart racing in a desperate, erratic rhythm as it struggled to pump blood through a failing system. Marie stood in the corner, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with what everyone assumed was traumatic shock. The walk from the apartment to the ambulance was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, the sirens wailing against the quiet Fort Worth night. Steven was still conscious, though barely, his eyes searching for his daughter in the chaos. The paramedics worked feverishly, administering oxygen and starting IV lines, but they were fighting an invisible enemy they didn't yet understand. In the emergency room at Osteopathic Medical Center, the staff saw a 38-year-old man in the throes of a massive, unexplained cardiac event. They checked his vitals, ran blood work, and performed CPR as his heart began to falter. But the chemical betrayal was too thorough. Barium poisoning is rare, and its symptoms, vomiting, paralysis, and heart failure, mirror so many other natural pathologies that no one thought to look for a high school chemistry experiment. At 11:45 p.m., the monitors in the trauma room emitted a single, flat, continuous tone. Steven Robards was pronounced dead. The cause of death was officially listed as a heart attack, a tragic, sudden end for a man in the prime of his life. In the waiting room, Marie received the news with a grief that seemed entirely genuine to the doctors and the relatives who soon arrived to comfort her. She wept for the father she had just killed, her tears a final, brilliant act in the tragedy she had written. The apartment in Fort Worth was now empty of its king, and as the grieving daughter prepared to leave the state, she felt a cold, simmering sense of relief. The formula had worked. The fantasy of Florida was finally within her reach, and for a year, the secret of what really happened on that cold February night would remain buried as deep as her father. The burial of Steven Robards was a somber, gray affair, a gathering of grieving relatives and confused colleagues who simply could not reconcile the image of the healthy, 38-year-old man with the reality of the wooden box being lowered into the Texas soil. Marie was the undisputed centerpiece of this tragedy, a figure of profound adolescent loss who clung to her mother, Beth, with a desperation that every observer found heartbreakingly appropriate. No one noticed the cold, calculating relief behind her black veil, or the way she already seemed to be looking past the graveyard, across the state lines toward the coast of Florida. For Marie, the funeral was not a goodbye to a father, but the successful closing of a chapter she had written in the margins of her chemistry textbooks. Following the interment, the legal and social hurdles that had once kept Marie anchored to the suburban landscape of Fort Worth dissolved as if they had never existed. With Steven gone, custody was no longer a matter of judicial decree or bitter negotiation. It was a settled reality. Within weeks, the quiet apartment was packed into boxes, the memories of her father's meticulously timed routines were discarded, and Marie began the 1,100-mile journey toward the life she had hallucinated during those long nights in North Texas. The move to Florida was supposed to be the final act of her transformation, the moment when the hamlet of Eastern Hills High School could finally step off the stage and live in the perpetual sun she believed she had earned. Initially, the reality of life in Florida seemed to match her dark fantasy. She moved into her mother's home, a transition that offered the emotional spontaneity and the physical proximity she had craved since the divorce. She was no longer under the thumb of Steven's expectations, his tax assessor's logic, or his persistent, well-meaning questions about her homework. The air was thick with the scent of salt, and the temperatures regularly climbed into the 90s, a humid, vibrant contrast to the sterile environment of her father's home. She enrolled in a new high school, quickly establishing herself as a bright, if somewhat distant student, and began to build a persona that was entirely detached from the girl who had seasoned a skillet of ground beef with a stolen chemical. But a year is a long time for a secret to stay buried, especially one that carries the physical and spiritual weight of a human life. As the first anniversary of Steven's death approached in February 1994, the facade Marie had built began to show its first microscopic cracks. The ghost of her father, much like the king in the play she had studied with such morbid intensity, did not stay quietly in the ground. Marie began to suffer from persistent insomnia, her nights filled with the vivid, terrifying memory of the sounds her father had made in the bathroom while the barium acetate shut down his nervous system. The perfect life in Florida was being corroded from the inside, poisoned by the very act that had secured its existence. She became increasingly erratic in her social interactions, her academic brilliance replaced by a brooding, distracted intensity that worried her new acquaintances. Her friends noticed that she would often stare into the distance for minutes at a time, or react with disproportionate, jagged emotion to the simplest mentions of family or grief. It was during this period of psychological fraying that she grew close to a classmate named Stacy High. Stacy was everything Marie used to be, cheerful, stable, and deeply empathetic. And perhaps it was that very empathy that made her a dangerous confidant. Marie saw in Stacy a vessel for her own guilt, a way to finally purge the Hebanon that was now pouring into her own troubled soul. The tipping point arrived in the spring of 1994, over a year after the crime, during a quiet sleepover at Stacy's house. The two teenagers were in the basement, the room dimly lit by the flickering glow of a television and the pale moonlight filtering through a high, narrow window. The atmosphere was intimate, the kind of safe, enclosed space where the most dangerous secrets feel lighter than they do in the daylight. They had been talking for hours about their futures and the pressures of being young when the conversation drifted, as it almost always did when Marie was involved, toward the subject of her father's sudden, tragic passing. Marie began to weep, but it was not the practiced, theatrical grief she had displayed at the funeral in Fort Worth. This was a raw, jagged unraveling of a mind that could no longer contain its own history. In low, trembling tones, she admitted to Stacy that the world didn't understand what had really happened in that apartment. She confessed that the heart attack everyone spoke of was a carefully constructed lie. a lie she had created with a stolen baggie of chemicals and a home-cooked meal. Stacy sat in the deep shadows, her breath hitching as Marie detailed the cold, clinical logic of the murder. She described how she had slipped the barium acetate into the tacos, how she had watched him eat, and how she had stood in the hallway, listening to him die in agony. The confession was a tidal wave of terrifying detail. Marie explained that her motive had been entirely selfish. She simply couldn't endure another day of her father's rules, and he was the only physical obstacle standing between her and her mother's house. She described the symptoms of the barium poisoning with a detached, scientific accuracy that chilled Stacy to the bone, noting the creeping paralysis and the way his heart had eventually given up. She admitted that she had wanted him gone to secure her own freedom, but now that he was dead, she couldn't stop seeing his face in her dreams. The play she had rehearsed in high school had become her permanent reality, and the guilt was a phantom she could no longer outrun. For Stacy, the revelation was a psychological burden she was never meant to carry. She listened as her best friend described the premeditated destruction of a man who had adored her, realizing with a mounting horror that the girl sitting across from her was a stranger, a killer who had successfully manipulated an entire community, a police department, and a medical examiner. Marie begged Stacy to keep the secret, telling her that if the truth ever surfaced, her new life in Florida would be destroyed, and her mother would never look at her the outside again. She pleaded for Stacy's silence, unaware that the weight of the confession was already beginning to crush the very friendship that had inspired it. The night ended in a heavy, suffocating silence, the two girls lying in the darkness, one briefly relieved by the purge, and the other haunted by a truth she could never unhear. The silence that followed Marie's confession in that Florida basement did not bring the peace she had hoped for. Instead, it acted as a slow-release toxin, working its way through the conscience of the only person who now shared her burden. Stacy High spent the weeks following the sleepover in a state of quiet, vibrating terror. Every time she looked at Marie, she no longer saw the grieving daughter or the brilliant student. She saw the cold, calculated movement of a girl who had watched her father die for the sake of a beach in Florida. The weight was physically unbearable. Stacy found herself unable to focus in class, the scent of the school's floor wax and the mundane chatter of her peers feeling like an insult to the secret she carried. She stopped eating. Her sleep was haunted by the image of a man she had never met gasping for air in a Texas bathroom, and finally, the pressure reached a breaking point. In the late spring of 1994, Stacy finally sat down with her mother. The conversation was jagged, filled with the kind of hesitations and stammers that precede a world-altering truth. When the words finally came out, when she recounted the story of the stolen barium acetate and the poisoned tacos, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Stacy's mother, realizing the gravity of what she had just heard, didn't hesitate. She contacted the school counselor, who in turn reached out to the local authorities. The secret that had traveled 1,200 miles from Fort Worth was finally being handed back to the people who could do something about it. The initial report landed on the desk of the Fort Worth Police Department like a piece of dark fiction. It had been over a year since Steven Robards had been buried. The case was closed, the death certificate signed and filed under natural causes cardiac arrest. To the detectives in Texas, the tip from Florida sounded like the hysterical imaginings of a teenager or a plot point from a movie. Why would an honors student, a girl with no history of violence or rebellion, kill the father who had provided her with everything? But the details Stacy provided were too specific to ignore. She mentioned the chemical by name, barium acetate, a compound so obscure that a typical teenager wouldn't even know it existed, let alone its specific physiological effects. Sergeant Danny Nuttall and the investigators at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office began the painstaking process of looking backward. They pulled the original file on Steven Robards, searching for anything they might have missed in the frantic hours of his death. The original toxicology report was clean, but that was the problem. Standard toxicology screens in 1993 were designed to catch common drugs of abuse, alcohol, or well-known poisons like arsenic or cyanide. Barium was not on the list. It was an invisible killer. a substance that leaves the body quickly and mimics the symptoms of a natural heart attack so perfectly that it had bypassed the most basic defenses of the medical system. The pivot in the investigation came when the police realized that to prove a crime had been committed, they would have to perform the most grisly task of all. They had to bring Steven Robards back from the ground. The exhumation was scheduled for a humid Texas morning, the kind where the fog clings to the tombstones like a wet shroud. The sound of the backhoe breaking the earth was a rhythmic, violent intrusion into the quiet of the cemetery. Detectives stood by in silence, the air heavy with the metallic scent of damp soil and the mechanical hum of the machinery. They were looking for a ghost, a physical remnant of a betrayal that had been buried for 15 months. When the casket was finally raised and opened in the sterile, brightly lit environment of the morgue, the investigators were met with a stroke of grim luck. Because of the specific embalming process and the way the body had been preserved, Steven's tissues were still viable for testing. The medical examiners didn't just need to find barium, they needed to find it in concentrations that ruled out environmental exposure. They focused on the hair, the liver, and the heart tissue, the places where the juice of cursed Hebanon would have left its mark. The lab work was a marathon of high-stakes science. The technicians used atomic absorption spectroscopy, a process that involves vaporizing samples to detect specific metallic elements. For days, the machines hummed in the background of the lab, a sterile, high-frequency sound that felt like a countdown. When the results finally flickered across the computer screens, the room went cold. The levels of barium in Steven Robards' system were staggering, hundreds of times higher than what could be considered normal. The natural heart attack had been a chemical execution. The science had finally caught up to the story Marie had told in the dark of a Florida basement. While the scientists worked on the how, the detectives shifted their focus to the where. They descended upon Eastern Hills High School, moving through the halls that Marie had walked a year earlier. They interviewed the chemistry teachers, their questions cutting through the nostalgia of the school year. The breakthrough happened in the supply room. A review of the old inventory logs, the paper trails that Marie thought no one would ever check, showed a discrepancy. A container of barium acetate had been noted as missing or depleted around the same time Steven had died. The teachers remembered Marie as the star student, the girl who had unfettered access to the lab, the girl who was always asking questions that seemed to go beyond the curriculum. The social echo of the investigation began to ripple through Fort Worth. Rumors of the exhumation spread like wildfire through the suburban neighborhoods. The image of the perfect Robards family was being dismantled in the public eye. People who had comforted Marie at the funeral now felt a cold shiver of realization. They remembered her tears, her black dress, and the way she had clung to her mother, and they realized they had been witnesses to a masterclass in sociopathic performance. The community was no longer mourning a tragic death. They were watching the emergence of a teenage predator. As the detectives gathered the last pieces of the puzzle, the school records, the lab results, and the haunting testimony from Stacy High, they realized they had enough for an arrest. The investigation had moved from a skeptical phone call to a scientific certainty. They had the formula, they had the motive, and they had the physical evidence of the poison in the man's very bones. The girl who had tried to rewrite her life with a chemical solution was about to find out that the truth, much like the barium she had used, is nearly impossible to keep hidden forever. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a transition from the quiet suburbs to the cold reality of a Texas courtroom. In 1995, the Tarrant County courtroom was transformed into the final act of a tragedy Marie Robards could no longer control. She sat at the defense table, her appearance, a simple white blouse and modest hair, deliberately styled to mirror the innocent honors student the world once admired. But the prosecution was relentless. They presented the physical evidence of the stolen barium acetate and the academic records that proved she understood exactly what the chemical would do to a human heart. The defense attempted a desperate pivot, arguing that Marie was merely a confused child who never intended to kill, only to make Steven ill enough to force a change in custody. It was a plea for mercy based on a tragic mistake, but the jury refused to buy the script. They focused on the hours of calculated silence as she watched her father die. In a verdict that cut through the suburban quiet of Fort Worth, Marie was found guilty of murder. The judge's voice was cold as he delivered a 27-year sentence, a definitive, crushing end to the Florida fantasy she had killed to achieve. She would eventually be released on parole in 2003 after serving only 7 years, leaving behind a legacy of chemical betrayal that remains one of Texas's most chilling domestic crimes. The story of Marie Robards remains a dark footnote in Texas history, a reminder that the most dangerous toxins are often brewed in the quietest hearts. Today, the suburban streets of Fort Worth have moved on, but the name of Steven Robards is forever linked to a chemical betrayal that defied nature. Marie vanished into anonymity after her 2003 release, leaving behind a ghost that Shakespeare would have recognized, a king dead for a daughter's fantasy of a son that never truly warmed her. The case is closed, but the shadow of the Hamlet poisoner still lingers in the halls of Eastern Hills. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.